Somewhere on the plains of East Africa, roughly 2 million years ago, a group of early hominins were doing something that had absolutely nothing to do with race, identity, or appearance. They were trying to survive. Under a relentless equatorial sun, natural selection was quietly running one of the longest experiments in human history. And the result of that experiment was dark skin. Not as a choice, not as a statement, but as a biological shield. There are no accounts of this moment, the way there are accounts of singed beards in a gunpowder lab, because this wasn't an accident that happened in an afternoon. It was a slow, grinding process that played out over hundreds of thousands of years, one imperceptible generation at a time. And yet, that gradual darkening of human skin eventually became one of the most consequential adaptations in the history of our species, the starting point from which every skin tone walking the earth today would eventually branch. So how did humans go from uniformly dark-skinned in Africa to the entire spectrum of skin tones we see across the globe today? The answer takes us through a molecule called melanin, a devastating vitamin deficiency hiding inside sunlight itself, a migration out of Africa that changed everything, and a genetic trade-off that different populations solved in strikingly different ways depending on exactly where on Earth they ended up. Let's start with what melanin actually does, because understanding the basic biology explains why everything that followed happened the way it did. Melanin is a pigment produced by cells called melanocytes, and it comes in two main forms: eumelanin, which produces brown and black tones, and pheomelanin, which produces reddish and yellow tones. The amount and type of melanin in your skin functions as a natural filter against ultraviolet radiation from the sun. That filtering effect is the entire secret behind everything skin color would eventually be used for, whether that meant protecting deep skin layers from UV damage, or, later, allowing enough UV through to keep the body running properly in places where sunlight was scarce. In humans' earliest days, before modern humans existed at all, our ancestors were most likely covered in fur, the way most other primates still are today, with pale skin hidden safely underneath. Losing that fur is exactly the kind of change you'd expect from creatures adapting to a hot, high-exertion life on the open savanna, since bare, sweat-glanded skin allowed for far more efficient cooling than a full coat of hair ever could. For generations, our ancestors' bodies were being reshaped by heat management long before skin tone itself became the main event. That changed once losing the fur left bare skin directly exposed to intense equatorial sunlight for the very first time. Between roughly 1.2 and 2 million years ago, early hominins evolved dark, melanin-rich skin, and the reason was genuinely urgent. Ultraviolet radiation breaks down folate, a B vitamin critical for cell division, and for the healthy development of a fetus during pregnancy. Without enough natural protection, chronic UV exposure would have caused folate deficiencies severe enough to cause birth defects and reduce reproductive success generation after generation. Dark, eumelanin-rich skin blocked enough of that radiation to keep folate levels stable, and the genetic variants producing that dark pigmentation spread rapidly through the population, not because anyone chose them, but because the alternative was measurably less likely to survive and reproduce. The protective effect alone was significant. Bodies that had spent their entire evolutionary history without this shield suddenly had one, and that kind of advantage often mattered as much across 100,000 years as any single dramatic event ever could. Once dark skin had proven itself essential under the equatorial sun, the next major shift came from an entirely different direction: migration. Beginning around 70,000 years ago, and in smaller waves before that, groups of modern humans began moving out of Africa into Europe, Central Asia, and eventually every other inhabited continent on Earth. And each of these migrations followed a fairly logical, almost obvious next step from whatever environment came before it. Populations moving into higher latitudes encountered something Africa never had: long winters and weak, low-angle sunlight for much of the year. This was a genuinely significant environmental shift because it flipped the original problem on its head. Where equatorial sun once threatened to destroy folate, weak northern sunlight now threatens something else entirely: the body's ability to produce enough vitamin D. The next major limitation was the skin itself. Vitamin D synthesis happens when UVB radiation strikes the skin, and dark, heavily melaninated skin, so effective at blocking UV near the equator, simply couldn't let enough of that same radiation through in places where sunlight was already scarce for much of the year. Populations that retained very dark skin in low UV environments risked chronic vitamin D deficiency, a condition linked to rickets, weakened bones, and reduced fertility. Once genetic variants emerged that reduced melanin production, allowing more UVB to reach the deeper layers of skin, those variants spread through northern populations for exactly the same reason dark skin had spread through African populations tens of thousands of years earlier, because they solved an urgent survival problem in the specific environment where people now lived. By roughly 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, populations across northern Europe carried genetic variants for notably lighter skin, representing a genuine evolutionary leap in vitamin D efficiency compared to the darker skin their distant ancestors had carried out of Africa. Researchers studying ancient DNA have also found something scientists initially found surprising: that lighter skin genes appeared and spread in different regions at different times, and through different genetic mutations entirely. When populations migrated into East Asia, a largely separate set of genetic changes produced lighter skin there as well, arriving at a broadly similar outcome through a genuinely different biological route. This is genuinely one of evolution's more elegant and underappreciated patterns, because it shows that lighter skin wasn't a single invention that spread outward from one origin point. It evolved independently, multiple times, in different populations facing the same basic problem of too little sunlight. It's also worth noting that skin tone didn't shift along a single straight line during this period. Alongside changes in Europe and East Asia, populations in places like the high Andes, the Arctic, and parts of Southeast Asia developed their own distinct pigmentation patterns, shaped by unique combinations of altitude, diet, and sun exposure. Some Arctic populations, for instance, retained darker skin despite low sunlight, likely because traditional diets rich in vitamin D from fish and marine mammals reduced the pressure on skin itself to solve the problem. The story of human skin color, in other words, doesn't just lead to a simple light to dark gradient by latitude. It branches, with different populations arriving at their own solutions depending on sunlight, diet, and geography, all rooted in the same basic biological trade-off between folate protection and vitamin D production. From there, human populations continued mixing, migrating, and intermarrying across every subsequent era of history, gradually blending the sharp genetic boundaries that isolation had once created. Historians and geneticists studying this period point to a broader pattern worth appreciating. Skin color wasn't a fixed marker of ancestry frozen in time. It was, and still is, an ongoing adaptation, responsive to environment, in the same way that lactose tolerance, high-altitude oxygen efficiency, and disease resistance evolved in different populations facing different local pressures. Once this variation existed across humanity, it landed in social and political contexts that over the following centuries would completely and often tragically distort its meaning, layering ideas of hierarchy and race onto a trait that began as nothing more than a molecule's response to sunlight. That transformation, from a simple survival adaptation into a marker loaded with social weight, is a very different story than the biological one, and one worth telling entirely on its own.